Welcome. My name's Jim Reeves. I'm the General Manager of the Institute for Sustainable Resources here at QUT. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and on which we have the privilege of living and enjoying, particularly the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'll be the chair, but it's my role now to do a few housekeeping, deal with a few housekeeping issues. Toilets are out down the corridor, just if you go out and turn right, there's some there, and there are some directly underneath you at the back there, at the back of the building. If there is any need to evacuate the building, there'll be the usual signals. I'm not going to try and imitate them, but you'll be directed, and the assembly area is directly behind the building here in the courtyard. Firstly, I'd like to also welcome you to QUT. It's an interesting sort of, I guess, metaphor for the topics that we're going to cover today. QUT occupies a very historic site. In fact, it's got probably one of the most historic buildings in Queensland, the old Government House here, which has just been restored, but there are a lot of heritage listed buildings on this site. We've just embarked on a $230 million project to build a very new building at the southern end of the campus, a Science and Technology Precinct, which will be a new gateway that connects the Goodwill Bridge and that sort of entrance. It's a very exciting project, but we also have to work within a framework of buildings that were built a long time ago, have important heritage qualities that are recognised, but which have to sort of be adapted to meet new paradigms, and it creates special issues for us. So this is something that an area that we're very, very interested in as well. I'll be chairing the first session, but before I do, to set the context of the day, I'd like to introduce the chair of the Queensland Heritage Commission, David Eads. David is the chair of the Heritage Council and is the director of PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he practices in the area of urban economics and has a keen interest in the impacts social, technological and environmental change has on heritage places. So I'd like to introduce David.
Thanks, Jim. Could I thank everybody that's come along today. There'll be plenty of chance for thank yous at the end, I'm sure. I'd also like to add my recognition to the traditional owners of this place, if I could, Jim. Could I just, before we go on further, thank DERM, thank QUT and my fellow Heritage Councillors for supporting this event. We've been overwhelmed with the numbers. We've had to change the venue. And I guess the speakers who have travelled from all over Australia, I obviously thank them as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the older commercial buildings in our city centres and around our nation are facing some obvious pressures in today's environment. Substantial increases in vacancy. In this town alone, we will see vacancies in the commercial area of 14–15% over the next couple of years. Falling face rents. Most capital cities in Australia have seen substantial reductions in rents of commercial buildings in the last 18 months to 2 years. Increased outgoings and an ever-increasing compliance burden. But for our heritage buildings in particular, there are even more insidious threats that will cause them to become obsolescent well ahead of their time. Whilst largely market-driven, there are also a number of policy settings which will exacerbate this demise. The market is looking at energy savings, obviously, in the face of dramatic increases in energy costs, and if and when we see a cost on carbon, that will certainly make that requirement to save money even more so. The demand for ethical investment. Both owner-occupiers and investment organisations are looking ever more these days at buildings that reflect what they want to be seen as in the marketplace and in the community, and that is being environmentally aware and conscious. And as a result of that, for most of them, the preference is to buy a building that actually reflects that ethical view. And at the same time, on the tenant side, on the demand side, a rapidly increasing demand for buildings that meet certain standards of operation. Technology changes, optic fibre, telecommuting, teleconferencing, hot desking are all having an effect on the way buildings are structured and buildings operate. And unfortunately, a lot of our older buildings do not necessarily have the flexibility to respond to these demands, particularly if the fabric is to be respected. On the policy front, and I should say at the outset that I'm not for a moment challenging that these policy settings are not laudable. They are both laudable and necessary. However, I think in many cases we don't really consider the ramifications for older buildings when we set these policies. I talk, of course, of mandatory disclosure on energy ratings for commercial buildings. We now have an environment where there is a requirement both on sale and on lease to actually declare the energy ratings of buildings. Again, Green Stars and Neighbours ratings of buildings, whilst laudable, do have obvious issues for older buildings, and particularly those that are significant from a heritage point of view. And I guess, for me, we're in a bit of a time warp with this. I recently did some work in Sydney for New South Wales Treasury, looking at a couple of their very, very iconic city buildings, looking at their commercial viability, if you like. And of course, you sit there and do the numbers and end up with a whole bunch of red on the bottom of the page and say, well, they don't work from a commercial point of view. But if you stand back and have a look at the reasons why they don't work because they were built in an era before motor vehicles, they were built in an era before electricity, and they were built in an era where there was a high reliance on public transport and a whole range of other things. And you can't help reflect that maybe if we hold on to those for another 10 or 15 years, it will be those very things that they can make those buildings attractive again, that we don't need that much car parking, that we are very conscious about natural light and natural ventilation, and we really are in a bit of a hole pattern for a lot of those buildings. And I guess what today is about is perhaps exploring whether there aren't ways those that are active in the heritage movement, can provide either an insight for or a consciousness-raising process to let the regulators, the policy makers and in fact the consumers of these buildings more aware of the outcomes that if we just remain hands-off. As I said, the objective of today's forum is to examine these in more detail. We've got some terrific speakers. We've actually put together, I guess, a range of speakers that represent the whole continuum of the consideration of buildings and their operation. And I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what they have to say, and we will have some time at the end to pull together those threads, hopefully in a way which allows us to carry some actions from this meeting into the marketplace. So Jim, thank you for the opportunity to set the context, and I will hand back to you.